Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon from New York City. My name is Aaron Mertz, and I'm the director of the Aspen Institute Science and Society program. This afternoon's event is a partnership between the Aspen Institute series Conversations with Great Leaders in memory of Preston Robert Tisch and the Science and Society program. The Conversations with Great Leaders series is now in its 13th year and is generously funded by the Tisch family, Steve Tisch, Laurie Tisch, Lizzie and Jonathan Tisch, and the Laurie M. Tisch Illumination Fund. The series highlights leadership in action through interviews with key leaders from all sectors of civic life, such as today's panelists. The Science and Society program was founded 3 years ago as part of the Health, Medicine, and Society program and seeks to democratize science as a guiding force for public good. To accomplish that goal, we convene experts in solutions-oriented strategy sessions, mobilize a diverse constituency of science advocates, and implement public outreach efforts and initiatives. The program wishes to acknowledge support from our lead partner, Johnson & Johnson, as well as from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and the Smart Family Foundation of New York. Today, we have a fantastic lineup of leaders from different sectors who have thought deeply about and who are making possible human space travel. They will consider the challenges facing our society and planet as we look up and out, including the implications of human space travel for the economy, international relations, and the environment here on Earth. I'm delighted to introduce our special guests. The Honorable Charles F. Bolden, Jr., Major General of the United States Marine Corps, was the administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, from July 2009 until 2017. His 34-year career with the Marine Corps included 14 years as a member of NASA's astronaut office. After joining the office in 1980, he traveled into orbit 4 times aboard the space shuttle between 1986 and 1994, commanding 2 of the missions and piloting 2 others. Today, in addition to his numerous professional affiliations, General Bolden serves as the founder and CEO Emeritus of the Charles F. Bolden Group. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree from the U.S. Naval Academy and a Master of Science degree from the University of Southern California. Dr. Ariel Ekblaw is the founder and director of the MIT Space Exploration Initiative, a team of over 50 graduate students, staff, and faculty actively prototyping the artifacts of our sci-fi space future. Founded in 2016, the initiative now includes a portfolio of over 40 research projects focused on life in space, from astrobiology to space habitats, and supports an accelerator-like R&D program that enables a broad range of payload development. Her prior work experience includes supersymmetry research and big data programming at the CERN Particle Physics Laboratory, user-centered design and product development at Microsoft Azure, microgravity research with NASA, and Mars 2020 rover hardware systems engineering at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. She received her undergraduate degree in physics and mathematics and philosophy from Yale University, a master's from the MIT Media Lab, and a PhD from MIT. Dr. David Munns is Associate Professor of the History of Science and Technology at John Jay College, CUNY. His published work encompasses the history of modern life in physical sciences and technology, environmental history, Anthropocene studies, and waste studies. His most recent book, co-authored with Karen Nicholson, Far Beyond the Moon, A History of Life Support Systems in the Space Age, reveals how the development of artificial life support systems were as important as the development of rockets in the space age. Dr. Munns earned his MPhil from the University of Sydney and his PhD from the Johns Hopkins University. Our moderator, Marina Koren, is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where she covers all things space, from astronaut missions and robotic explorers to the wonders of the solar system and beyond. She has written Dispatches from Cape Canaveral in Florida, NASA's headquarters in Washington, D.C., and SpaceX's launch site in South Texas, the last of which appeared in the Best American Science and Nature Writing of 2021. Before working in science journalism, she was a breaking news and political reporter. To our audience, please enter your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to answer as many of them as possible at the end of the discussion, and we have left open the chat if you wish to offer comments there. Marina, I'll now hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for those introductions. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panelists. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you everyone who is joining us on Zoom. I'd like to start today's discussion by talking about something that is very much on everyone's minds right now, and that is, of course, the war on Ukraine. Over the last week, we have seen what the Russian invasion has meant for the Ukrainian people, what it has meant for relationships between different countries, and what it means for cooperation between spacefaring nations. Space projects between Russia, for example, are already falling apart or beginning to fray. And we have a big question for this panel today, which is, what does being multiplanetary mean for life here on Earth? And I'm wondering, I would love to hear from you how that question fits into this moment in history and how it will fit into moments still to come. And I'll start with you, Charlie, if you'd like to.
Thank you very much, Marina. And thanks very much to the Aspen Institute for allowing me to be a part of this. It's great to be with David and Ariel and you. You know, great question. And it's particularly for those of us who espouse that space is the ultimate peacemaker, or space is the ultimate place where people can come together and work collaboratively, no matter what their relationship is down here on Earth. I think we're all seeing that even the International Space Station is being stressed today, not because of anything that's going on station, but again, because of mostly the rhetoric down here on the ground. And I'm not gonna to get in the middle of it, but I think you do see that when you get comments out of NASA, they are mostly about the long years that we have been working collaboratively and how we hope that we'll work through this and we'll continue to be in space for Earth. You know, one of the things that we always tell people is we go to the International Space Station and we do research and development to benefit humanity, to make life better back here on Earth. We just kind of wish we'd hear a little bit of the same hopeful rhetoric from the Russians, but we're still waiting. But I think it's stressing our relationship. It is also stressing a relationship that I had hoped would get better or would even start, and that's the relationship between the United States and China. But as a result of China's collaboration or apparent collaboration with the Russians, that doesn't seem to be on the table right now anyway. So I'll stop right there and see what everybody else thinks. Okay, Ariel, you don't get off free. Everybody's gotta jump in here.
Yeah, sure, you took the opener for us. Thank you, Charlie. Well, Marina, thank you again for having me. It's again, just to echo what Charlie said, it's an honor to be here with the Aspen Institute and to be on a panel with Major General Bolden and with Mr. Munns and David. I believe we agreed to use first names, so we'll go from there. It's a tough question, certainly, on the international and geopolitics front right now. I will say at MIT, we really cherish the opportunity to be able to bring international students and work in a highly collaborative international environment. And so when things like this happen on the geopolitical stage, we try to reassure our students that we are still a home for people from all around the world to come and collaborate together meaningfully on rigorous research, and that the bonds that can be made in early stage academic work, and it also happens in companies and in industry and other venues, but particularly here in academia, where we're teaching and training students from all around the world. And we hope that when they go back to their countries, whether they are from China or from Russia or from Ukraine or any other country, that we're able to build for the future some of these relationships that can help us navigate future issues like this. Now, whether we have those kind of relationships that'll be able to help us go through this very rocky situation right now, it's yet to be seen. But I think it's a good thing to remember that there are American and Russian, so cosmonauts and astronauts on station working together right now. There are NASA astronauts training in Roscosmos and Russian astronauts training at NASA. And we would hope, to echo what Charlie said, that collaboration can continue and not endanger the ISS, but would also be helpful to hear from Russia and our partners that they also commit to a peaceful future and a continuation of committed resources to these joint space endeavors.
And so again, thank you to Marina and the Aspen Institute for hosting this wonderful opportunity. Like my panelists, we all hope for a peaceful and rapid peaceful solution to the war in Ukraine. as a historian, I have sort of less knowledge about sort of the current day-to-day aspects of NASA, but looking back over the history of the space program, although it was situated in a context of Cold War rivalry between the then Soviet Union and the United States, there was actually always some cooperation in space, even between Cold War rivals. And so space has always been one of those venues and places where cooperation, even between seemingly implacable rivals, could actually take place. Very famously, the first handshake from astronauts and cosmonauts on the Soyuz. And so, hopefully, space and the ISS, I think Ariel is right, might be a place where more peaceful transitions can occur as they have occurred in the past.
Right. Yeah. And so, geopolitical conflicts aside, I'm curious to hear. That's the segue. I'm curious to hear from you all what you think are the most interesting and complicated challenges that are ahead in the effort to expand our presence in space, whether that's going back to the moon again, actually building an outpost there, or eventually putting people on Mars. What are the challenges you're thinking about most, whether they're technical, financial, cultural? And I'll start with you, David, because I know that you have worked a lot on what it takes to get people into deep space, human support systems, for example.
Yes, the new book that I co-authored with my very eminent German co-author. We had a fantastic time looking at the history of efforts to build life support systems from the earliest days, even before Sputnik went up in 1957, but certainly once both animal models and then humans started going up into space in the 1960s for very short periods of time, and then for longer periods of time, developing whole microcosms, as they called it, of little Earths. They called them little Earths going up in these tiny space vehicles, which, seem pretty precarious to us now, but at the time, it was cutting edge science. And one of the things that they discovered pretty early on was that an effective way was to build it from the sort of the ground up. Sanitation and waste disposal, carbon dioxide as a waste, bodily water as a waste. These things became pressing issues from the very outset. And so the people both in the Soviet Union and the United States who worked on this for many years, many still ongoing projects. They worked on what foods and plants could grow in outer space and how waste can be recycled as nutrients in a zero gravity or a minimal gravity environment. What's the effects of differing day lengths? One of the big research projects was all about, can we convert plants to a 15-day cycle for a moon base instead of a 24-hour daylight cycle as we have here on Earth? These kinds of fundamental assumptions about what these things meant. And these are ongoing challenges for the space age, and has been there for ages, as they really wanted to push over that boundary of living in space for not only sort of days and months, but years, even decades.
Marina, if I can say, just, David kind of whet my appetite for an example of how we have responded to some of the challenges that he mentioned. When he talked about how do we deal with waste, how do we deal with carbon dioxide and the like. If you look at the Perseverance rover that's on Mars today, it has an experiment called MOXIE that's actually taking the dominant carbon dioxide out of the Martian atmosphere and converting it into carbon, carbon monoxide, but oxygen for both breathing and hopefully in the future for propellant. If you look at how we treat waste on the International Space Station today, we used to dump water in the space shuttle program. Today, we capture about 97, 98% of all waste liquid whether it's perspiration or whatever, and we recycle it. So we always say, you know, today's coffee is tomorrow's fresh water. Those things have all been passed back to Earth, and we now have areas. I like to say, everybody wants to say, talk about Africa or third world or some third world countries, places. Here in my own United States, in some of our poorer states, we use the same technology that we're using on the International Space Station today to purify water, so that kids who never had clean drinking water now have clean drinking water at their disposal. So in solving some of the problems that David historically talks about, we have brought benefits back to Earth. And that's what we hope will continue to happen, no matter, you know, in space, no matter what happens down here on the planet.
Heartily seconded for that explanation of the crossover benefits for Earth and space technologies. We are also here at the MIT Space Exploration Initiative working on prototypes and hardware engineering for several of these different areas that David and Charlie have just raised, everything from fermentation to produce self-stable food that actually has a microbiome gut benefit and some umami and some improved flavor for that mental health of actually being able to sustain and enjoy yourself for a deep or long duration space mission, up to ecosystem level within the built environment, ECLIS, so environmental control and life support systems like air scrubbers. And what we're beginning to realize is that some of the technology that's necessary to answer Marina's question, what are these challenges to keep us from being multiplanetary? Some of these technologies for airtight habitation, good thermal regulation, could also potentially be spun out on Earth for areas that are trying to adapt to major climate changes and extreme weather. So we're thinking about, for the first time in California, homes that need to be airtight because of wildfires. This is not something that builders have long considered, but what do we do for space habitats? We make them airtight. And so being able to take some of these direct technology transfers back down to Earth is also really important for the work of the Space Initiative. I'll just close on this particular answer to Marina's question by saying, in addition to the technology barriers, we could probably all list off several others that we are trying to solve: radiation, effective propulsion for deep space missions. I think there's also a large policy framework question that we'll really need to begin tackling and getting right to support humanity being at this cusp of interplanetary civilization, which is how will we moderate multi-stakeholder activity in the space commons so as to avoid a tragedy of the commons. And as a concrete example, we're already seeing space debris as a really significant challenge in low Earth orbit. And this is a classic example of a tragedy of the commons situation. So I think there's a lot of law and policy and economic framework to be explored around being good stewards of the space commons.
Right, yeah, those are all fantastic and important framings. And I want to ask you about another framing, and this is something, Ariel, that you've thought deeply a lot about, is the ethical and cultural implications of going deeper into space. You know, what should decision makers choose to take with us when we go deeper into space? What should we leave behind? So I'm curious to hear from you what kinds of lessons we should take with us as we go deeper, but also what lessons from exploring space, trying to do this endeavor in the first place, should we be applying, and decision makers honestly should be applying right here on Earth?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Marina, for the question. One of the terms that we've coined at MIT in the last year is this notion of the anthropocosmos. And it's meant to build on the term Anthropocene. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but the critical idea here in the background is to say, with the Anthropocene, we now understand this to be a term that describes a period of dominant human activity on Earth for better and for worse. As we are entering this era, this expanded era of human activity in the cosmos, in the near neighborhood of our solar system, there will be great opportunities, but also significant responsibilities to being good actors in this anthropocosmos era. Some of the things that we, could take in a new light as we go out to venture further for exploration is there's a movement, and I cannot certainly myself claim credit for this. I would give credit to Danielle Wood and some other scholars at MIT who are thinking of, instead of calling it colonization, thinking about exploration or voyaging or other ways to try to decouple the really fraught legacy of colonization on Earth from the way that we want to actually take our activities and responsibly, ethically go forward into space. There are also practical questions about planetary protection. and what are our responsibilities to being able to introduce new technology to, say, the surface of Mars, and ensure that if we think we find life or traces of life on Mars, that we haven't contaminated that with our own samples before we are even able to really assess the situation. So NASA has long worked within a framework of planetary protection as an ethical and technical framework that governs space missions. There are, many other questions like this that we can conceive of, and quite a bit of policy work that maybe we can get into later in the conversation around how do we plan for multi-stakeholder activity on the moon. Property rights will have to be considered. Do we grant property rights to the moon, and to whom and by whom do we grant these rights, so that we can actually see a cislunar economy emerge? I'll pause there and let Charlie and David jump in, but those are a few of my thoughts on some of the ethical and policy questions that are facing us.
Charlie, David, would you like to add anything to that?
I think Ariel covered it pretty well. I'm not sure I have anything that I could add to it.
Yes, I have to say I agree. Looking from a historical point of view, the ethical and the policy considerations, as Ariel mentioned, NASA had long been in this policy of returning all waste to Earth that was produced in space, which is in and of itself a very famous and very fraught thing. Like all biological and material waste, mostly from the early missions, were all brought back to Earth very famously. They're evidently all stored at NASA somewhere. Maybe Charlie can tell us on this myth, this perhaps myth that where all the waste is stored. But those kinds of that I think reveals, as Ariel mentioned, that NASA had long had from really its very inception these kinds of deep ethical questions. So the society bit of science has always been part of the science bit of science. Science doesn't exist in a social vacuum. It always exists in the face of these societal questions and notions of who gets to own what, or whether or not anybody gets to own anything. These are also very important indeed. The early, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik to begin with, and this was an argument run by Walter McDougall in his book, From the Heavens and the Earth, many years ago, that actually solved a problem, which was that the Soviet Union simply declared that nobody owned space. And so nobody owned space, so everyone could go there. And so this resolved a sort of a conflict within the American camp, who wanted to sort of own space or claim something about space. So it is a very, even from the beginning, these kinds of things have gone on. But but also in terms of shared resources, that when waste is produced, who then owns the waste? Who owns your carbon dioxide once it's produced? Who gets to recycle it back to you if they can compress it and return it to you? That we have a sort of, in our society, we have a ownership over stuff that we consume, but we really don't have ownership over stuff that we return, and that's a sort of a major structural imbalance, which just isn't applicable on these very closed environments that you would be in for space. Carbon dioxide will be incredibly valuable on a lunar base, as it turns out, or a Mars base for that matter.
Yeah, a lot of homework to get done, I think. So usually when we talk about space exploration, we tend to use terms like, humankind, humanity, the human species, but I'd like to narrow that down just a little bit to the average person. Obviously, 2021 was a huge year for commercial space flight, and it looks like 2022 will also be a really big year for that effort. And space companies that are doing that, they're saying that, they're doing these missions because they want to lower the cost eventually and have regular people go into space. Of course, that can be sometimes a little hard to parse because they don't reveal how much the missions that they're doing now cost. But I'm wondering how you all see this story unfolding of commercial spaceflight, whether it's into low Earth orbit, or for our purposes with this panel today, all the way to Mars, what are some realistic timelines? You know, how should we kind of be checking ourselves in these discussions? And maybe I'll go to Charlie to start.
Yeah, you're going to get. I'm not a big. I'm Danielle Wood, who was mentioned earlier. Danielle and I share the disdain for the use of the term colonization. Not a good word to choose for what some people want to do, but I also happen to be one who believes that I think the day that we're going to send millions of people to space are long ways away, because we don't need to send millions of people to space, especially not to deep space. Mars is not a pleasant place to live. So when people, talk about moving humanity to Mars as sort of a planet B, we should realize that that's impractical and that's not realistic. And we need to take care of planet A, which is Earth. So it gives us a challenge to try to, Ariel's already alluded to some of this, to try to figure out how do we clean up the planet on which we live right now and make it sustainable for us until the sun goes away, to be quite honest. And one of the things I really like about Jeff Bezos and his vision is he wants to move stuff like heavy manufacturing, polluting kinds of manufacturing off the planet and into low Earth orbit or even geo orbit somewhere else where you gradually clean up this planet where humans live, and you put bad things somewhere out in space where they either stay up there for long periods of time, or because there's a lot of vacuum in which to dissipate it, it gets dissipated. We're learning, I don't know that we've learned how to recycle solid waste yet, but we're working on it. We're looking at ways, because the science of today, we have electron microscopes, we have 3D printers, we have all kinds of analytical material or instruments on the International Space Station today. So you don't need to bring all the physical material back to Earth that we used to study it. We study it right in place on the International Space Station and send the data down to Earth and make it accessible to everybody. That's the good thing about NASA, is everything they do is in the public domain. So, a biologist who has a study going on that, granted, it's his or her intellectual property, but that information goes into the public domain. And I think that's really important.
In addition to, thinking about the flights that we've all heard about in 2021 and the upcoming flights in 2022, one of the missions of our program here at MIT at the Space Exploration Initiative is to try and democratize access to space. And that is a term that's thrown around a lot now in the last several years by many different companies. We mean it very concretely in more than one way. One is we take students from a broad diversity of fields on parabolic flights, affectionately known as the vomit comet. So the zero-G flights where you can train students and get hardware tested for orbit. And what's important to us about the interdisciplinary feature of our program is that we're inviting artists and designers and philosophers and architects, in addition to folks like myself who are trained as scientists, to participate in building the artifacts that are going to be part of our life in space future, because we really believe for a richly envisioned life in space that is worth living, you do want this diversity of other ideas and not just solely science and engineering. And the reason that we have the privilege to do that is because we're standing on the shoulders of giants like NASA, who have been able to make enough progress on the science and engineering domain that we can begin to open this up more. We also think about democratizing access in terms of STEM and STEAM outreach. So letting the next generation of youth be engaged in building and designing space hardware. And one of our most successful programs was a CubeSat program that was around climate sensing, so that these young students were expected to build and design a CubeSat, and we tried to help them take it all the way to where they would get close to launch. And the goal was to have these young people feel invested in the future health and well-being of their own planet, and be able to do that by having a direct avenue to sense and take data about their planet. And we felt that that was an incredibly empowering opportunity. And so I think beyond just taking people to space for tourist opportunities, which is important. I think it's a good part of the ecosystem. I think it's an important part of an economy that we should grow. There are other really meaningful ways to also democratize access to space and give a broader swath of humanity a taste of what this domain has to offer.
How about you, Dave?
And I certainly, in comparison to my my honored colleagues here, I am not an expert on modern space policy or things. I have just a generalized knowledge, but to reinforce these kinds of things, historically, what was discovered most famously through the blue marble photograph from 1969 that was then very well taken up by the whole earth movement and the early environmental movement, is that the vision alone of seeing our planet from space is a transformative experience. And I think the photo does a lot of work too, but from what we hear from the people who have been up there, and Charlie can probably speak completely to this, is that once you've seen it, all of the astronauts whose memoirs I've read, they all comment on this kind of thing, and they all comment on the new cupola on the International Space Station. That it's just a place where people go and they just look at the planet, and it changes their worldview. Like this kind of, if there's something that can really change minds and change worldviews, it's these kinds of experiences. Presumably, Ariel's taking the students on the flight. I will threaten my own students with taking them on the vomit comment. That should be very good. That'll be good for public university students in New York City. Actually, I think that'd be quite good to change the worldview. And so that kind of as an act of democratization, as an act of putting these people out there. The other thing that was always very important to NASA was that when they first started going into space, it wasn't just rocket engineers. There were plant scientists, there were nutritionists, there was a vet, there were psychologists, there were any number of fields and specialities from right across scientific and technical fields, because they all had to come together in order to move anyone into space at all. We talked about this in the book, that there's this fun interaction between the rocket engineers at General Dynamics who are ringing up the biologists, and like they're just talking at cross purposes, because actually trying to get scientific specialities to talk to themselves or to talk to other sciences is a very difficult thing to do. We have a nice quote from one of them. They're going, "We just don't understand how biology, it isn't like engineering." And this was one of the problems that they had to get over. So that's also an act of democratization, is bringing all these people with different backgrounds together.
Yeah, we've used the term democratization several times, and I view, when I think of that, I think of Amanda Gorman going to space. How she paints pictures with her words so beautifully. I'm not an engineer technically, but I'm a person with an engineering and science background. And as hard as I try to paint word pictures to make people feel what I saw and what I experienced, I don't do a very good job at it. Where I think someone whose life has been spent in painting word pictures for people, it's just having that perspective of our planet. And you don't have to go to the moon, you don't have to go to Mars. I really think if you watched William Shatner when he came back, he just couldn't stop talking about the perspective that he got from just being outside Earth's atmosphere and having an opportunity to see our incredible planet from that vantage point. I think that's probably the most critical thing to allowing as many people to fly as possible, is because we will get the grandeur of our planet presented in so many different ways that we're going to reach far more people than we're able to reach today with people who've had the experience of going to space. 500, 600, that's not a lot of people. And especially when the vast majority of us have technical backgrounds and we don't even like painting word pictures. So, we need people who love that. That's their craft.
Yeah, I agree with you, Charlie, about a future where we move meaningful numbers of people off the planet. That seems like a very long way away, but I mean, dozens, hundreds. I'm curious if you think that NASA could get away with talking about space exploration a bit more like the way Elon Musk talks about it. We have to save humanity now.
No, that's not their job. And with all due respect, Elon is a visionary who I love, and he gets people really, really, really excited, but he doesn't have to deliver. NASA is an organization that is paid by the American taxpayer. And so we inspire as best we can. More recently, we've taken to trying to inform young people about science, technology, engineering, math, the arts, and design, so that they understand you don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to love numbers or know you love numbers, since most kids who are artists and designers find out that they use numbers all the time. But it's just trying to expose as many students as possible to the fact that they have a role to play in this grand thing that we call exploration, whether it's under the sea, whether it's on the planet, or whether it's out in space. But it's just getting them to understand that they too can play a role, because there's something that covers everybody, and STEM plus AD is the term I like to use instead of just STEM.
Steamed. I think Deva, a mutual colleague of ours,
Deva taught me, and Deva used steamed, and I'm with Deva. She taught me.
And I think part of what's so exciting, Marina, is part of what Charlie's describing. It is time to let students of all walks of life and different backgrounds and different interests hear that there is a place for them in the future of space. And it's not just outreach talk to inspire students for their careers. We're actually seeing with the Axiom plans for a commercial space station in orbit. They just raised $130 million Series B last year. So that's very real and is on the near-term horizon. Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' space company, preparing orbital reef and another commercial space station in LEO. Hopefully we get the ISS extended. I'm in the extend camp. I just am not ready to see it. I'm not ready to see it go away just yet. But these are opportunities for business parks in space, for microgravity concert halls in space. We are spinning out a spin out from MIT right now, which we'll be ready to talk about a little bit more in a few months, around how do you build space architecture that can scale the number of humans in space. So beyond just tubular aluminum pressure vessels, which is what the ISS is based on right now. And so we're not just dangling a carrot in front of these students to say, oh, we want to get you excited about your future career. Here's all these beautiful, ways to think about your role in space. It really is going to be a reality for them in their lifetimes. And I hope a reality for me within my own lifetime, to be able to spend time in space for practical purposes and for space tourism as well.
Yeah, well, I'm curious, one more question on the life support system. So David, when you hear, people like Musk talk about going to Mars, what comes to mind for you in terms of what that takes and how realistic should we be?
One of those is we conclude with it. Actually, it's part of the conclusion of our book, where somebody exactly asked this, like, what is the waste system like, Elon, when you go to waste? And these are questions that are constantly at the forefront. They may not be publicly made. They may not be the thing that's publicly talked about all the time, but they have been since the beginning, and now that this is it. There was also a great example from, I think, Thomas Paine, if I remember, one of the former NASA administrators. And so to bounce off Charlie, he gave a high school talk, and he talked about this sort of role of NASA, that NASA's role was really square, to use the sort of 1970s term. They were square. And that means that it may not be all that sexy, but it was practical. It was responsible. It was making steady progress, and one of those was in management of all of these systems that went on to make a life support system. And very famously early on in the Skylab project, there was the first space toilet, there was the prototype anyway of the space shower. Like these are very, as it turns out, insanely complicated systems to get right on board in space. But Payne then argued that actually what happens is if you want to build a lunar colony, I think he used a lunar colony, is that the thing that we should charge people for is their waste. They have to leave their material on the moon and then we build something out of it because it brings the valuable nutrients to the moon. That's what we should be charging people for. And I thought that was just like a remarkable sort of inversion of how we usually think about this thing that we call waste, but isn't really waste. We live in an enclosed biosphere, which actually very little comes in or out materially. There is no waste. There is no waste. We may throw things away, but in reality, we're just polluting our own bed. And the entire idea of waste is something that the space program has firmly confronted. And I think that we need to confront it a lot more squarely on the planet as well.
Okay, I think one more question for me, and then we'll go to some Q&A. I already see a few questions being queued up. And this question, I hope that no one yells at me for, but should we be trying to become a multiplanetary species? Because for me, that kind of future is not inevitable. It's not destined. It's a choice, in the same way that the idea that space activities can stay above conflict on Earth is more of in practice, a platitude than a certainty, as we're seeing this week. So what if we don't become a multiplanetary species? What if the moon is as far as humankind gets?
I'm a big fan of becoming a multi-planet species. It's just my definition of multi-planet species is a little bit different, say, than Elon's. Elon wants to die on Mars. I think that's crazy. I can't use somebody who wants to go and die in a place as fantastic as Mars. I really need that person or those people to come back to Earth and tell us what it was like, tell us what they saw, tell us what's different about Mars than Earth and what they learned there that might help us improve our own planet. That's the ultimate goal of sending humans away from the planet, is to help us figure out how to make it better. And that's why, NASA's vision is to take the things that we learn, and I'm paraphrasing here, to take the things that we know and learn and make life better for humanity here on the planet. And so I need everybody that travels to anywhere in space, please come back and share what you learned with everyone here to help make our planet better. So I think by traveling to as many planets, as many places as we can in the universe, since I believe it all came from the same beginning, help us understand how only Earth that we know of got to be this place that is habitable for humanity. What's dramatically different, and the only way we're going to find that is by having human beings go up and actually take a look at it. But robots can do lots of things, but they can't give you the human perspective of what's different out there and what there may be something better for humans. We won't know it until we get there, but I'd sure like to make planet Earth better by using what we find when we go to these other places in our solar system and beyond one of these days.
I think you have several kindred spirits on this panel, because I would certainly say I don't think any of us are the plan B space folks. We really do deeply believe in protecting Earth, and that space should be for the benefit of Earth. But that doesn't necessarily preclude us, as I think Charlie just beautifully laid out a vision of what it could mean to be a multiplanetary species, without necessarily stipulating that these are vast, grand cities and civilizations on other planets. It might be like McMurdo on the moon for quite a while, so an Antarctica research station where not everybody really wants to go to Antarctica. Only a few very bold humans, even right now, really want to go to Antarctica. And that's okay. But I completely agree with Charlie. As a scientist, I am very fond of robotic technology, and there's a reason JPL is so key to so much of the amazing work that NASA does, but it's part of the answer, not the sole answer. And there's so much science about our planetary system, how the Earth formed, that we can learn from Venus and Mars, maybe even from Europa as we push further out, that could benefit significantly from human missions. So we become multiplanetary or multi-celestial body, if not always all the planets, for the purpose of science, for the purpose of expanding our circles of awareness as a human species. And then I would also venture to say my personal passion is in microgravity space habitats. I think there's a lot that we still have yet to explore about this notion of floating space cities or cities in the asteroid belt that might be better justified than always trying to find ourselves some terra, some surface to live upon.
Well, for a lot of the research, Ariel, as you know very well, we don't want to be in a gravity environment.
Exactly.
When you look
we don't want to be in a
things
gravity.
like protein crystal growth, the studies of gene sequencing that's going on the International Space Station now, you go to some planet or somewhere that's got, no matter how small the gravity is, you're going to take away the advantage that you have in microgravity when you let things like proteins and atoms and molecules take their own orientation, and we learn so much more about them. I like to tell people, when we talk about RNA vaccines and people who say, well, but that happened all so quickly. I beg your pardon. We've been doing research with RNA for decades. And what you see with the RNA vaccines that are now saving people from COVID-19, that's the result of decades of research in space here on the planet. And that's, but it's the microgravity research that allows us to take a protein crystal and look at it in its own natural form, slice it and dice it, and look at it under an electron microscope and figure out how we keep bad things from happening inside our bodies.
Absolutely.
So, and I absolutely second all of my fellow panelists. I think from the history of building life support systems, one of the things that that both NASA and the Soviet Union went into really through the 1950s and 60s and 70s was actually not only for a multiplanetary species, but actually multi-species, multiplanetary. That actually humans, one of the issues that they came across was actually building a life support system solely for people. That if you only build it for people, it becomes a very strange thing and becomes actually somewhat unstable. But if you put in multi-species, if you link through not only physicochemical systems, but they experimented with any number of biological regenerative systems, there was a lot of work on that humans sort of need plants to be around. Not so much animals. Animals become more complicated, but certainly people need plants. And it's that gut microflora is your own little ecosystem inside you. You're inside an ecosystem. Everyone's inside these sort of multi-layered, multi-species ecosystem bubbles, which are increasingly complicated in every way. But this was sort of, a large amount of the life support research that we encountered was really about those kinds of things. So the dream of sort of, flying humans off to Mars, we should really think about flying little microcosms off to Mars, that these things are going to, that if you want to be on Mars, you have to take up not only humans, but also their gut microflora. You have to take up their plants. You have to take up, bacteria, like H.G. Wells was probably right in the end. Bacteria does a lot of the work for us.
The historian here has, David has brought out something, this may sound wild. Who knows if the first humans don't get to Mars and they find a bacteria or some life form there that loves human feces. And the byproduct or its waste is oxygen, or its waste is some other element that we need that's vital for humanity, or it's another kind of bacteria that we need in our own gut to keep us healthy. Who knows? We may find that serendipitous.
Now, I swear I didn't put Charlie up to this, but in the book, my co-author and I talk about a very famous early NASA recycling system called the Algatron, which did exactly that. It was an algae. Yeah. The nutrients of algae are the wastes of humans. So our feces, our carbon dioxide, feed the algae, and then the algae poops out oxygen, which we need, and it gives us protein, which we need. And so a lot of work went into these algae systems, or trying to put algae within a longer biological chain. But you're absolutely right. That bacteria would solve a lot of our problems, I think, Charlie.
Fingers crossed then, I guess. Okay, I think we're going to take a few questions, and there are already some ready for us. So just a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question of any of the panelists, please use the Q&A function. And I'm going to start, and then whoever would like to answer, jump in. Miguel asks, are we going to lose the public benefit of space exploration as the field becomes more privatized? If humanity has benefited from space exploration to date because the knowledge and innovation has become part of the public domain, how do you feel about the privatization and commodification of that knowledge in the future?
Let me take a wild stab at it. Many of the discoveries that I think will be made in this new era of space exploration are still going to come from government. The private sector, I don't see the private sector getting into the R&D business the way that the government does, because our job is to find new methods, new things that we can perfect and then hand off to the private sector. Tech transfer, that's my business in NASA. That's not the private sector's business, and most of them probably don't think about doing it because they want to keep it for themselves for their own profit. So I think government will always have a place in terms of technology development, technology transfer, and the like. It's just that we will purchase the service that allows us to get there. We'll purchase the laboratory space on an Axiom space station or a NanoRack space station or somebody else's space station, instead of NASA and ESA and the other space agencies having to pay for the infrastructure. We just go and we rent space in a place that has electron microscopes, that has 3D printers, and we go do our research the way we do today.
I can also see the government role in NASA continuing to capture the public's imagination and the kind of audacity of excitement around science and the vanguard of engineering as the government, NASA, pushes us out further beyond where a market exists. So we're seeing this commercialization right now because we're beginning to finally have companies that think that they have customers beyond just the anchor tenant of the government in low Earth orbit. But as NASA, NASA is going to be the one that takes us to Mars in many ways. Elon will maybe be along there and shaping that, but it's also going to be NASA driving the Europa Clipper mission and the Europa Lander mission and providing that inspiration for the deep space knowledge that's coming back for humanity and really inspires us. And then I can think of it as, emerging markets as customers grow and the commercialization follows on. But I think there's always a role for NASA to lead at this vanguard of exploration.
I'll give you an example we're getting ready to, there's a mission called DART, and Ariel, you have to help me with the acronym, but it's a satellite that's going to impact a small asteroid orbiting a larger asteroid to see if we can measure movement in that small asteroid as a method of planetary protection from an incoming asteroid. When I was the NASA administrator, we had a precursor to DART that we just could not sell on the Hill. We couldn't get Congress to buy it. And I think it was because it was an Obama program, and so everybody was opposed to it, but it was called ARM, the Asteroid Redirect Mission. The advantage to ARM was not only that we were going to see if we could thrust against the trajectory of an asteroid to get it to miss Earth, but we were also going to put astronauts on the surface of the asteroid to develop the technologies and techniques for mining of asteroids. It's easy for people, for hedge fund guys and other people say, we're going to go mine asteroids, which is going to get back to Ariel's issue of, okay, who's going to make the laws of property ownership and the like? we'll get there, but we've got to figure out how do we mine that stuff, and do we bring it back to Earth? Do we process it on the asteroid or on the moon or what? That was a side benefit of the asteroid redirect mission, and that's the kind of stuff that that the government needs to do, because I don't think the private sector is going to make that kind of investment. They're counting on the government, trying to help them figure out the rough ideas about technologies and techniques to use. We spent years on the bottom of the ocean off Key West in an analog system that we have been using for not forever, but for many decades now. NEMO is the acronym, but we spent several years with the crews on NEMO going out and staking out little areas of the ocean floor that we were using as analogs for the surface of an asteroid, to develop the tools and the kinds of techniques that we would need to use if we were going to take samples from that asteroid to bring back to Earth or to do something with. And that was going on as long as we were doing research trying to develop the asteroid redirect mission.
Another question from the chat. Space exploration was a popular aspiration when I was growing up. How can we make it an ongoing aspiration for youth today? And I think about this a lot because I remember there was a poll at one point saying that, I don't know how good the poll was, but young people wanted to be YouTube stars more than they wanted to be astronauts. But curious what you all think on that.
Yeah. Painfully true.
From a historical point of view, the space program really benefited from the sort of the early heroism and publicity of going into space, and the rhetoric of the frontier and the rhetoric of exploration. These things clearly resonated with the popular mind, as did rhetorics of beating the other side to wherever was going. And the moon landings were, at least in part, an exercise in beating the Russians to the moon. And so this sort of notion of competition is also there. It's also very revealing, and after reading quite a few memoirs of astronauts, is that children have a very different understanding about what the space program is all about. As every astronaut says in their memoir, the first question they get asked by a child is always, how do you pee in space?
How do you go to the bathroom?
And I was going to ask Charlie, is that true?
That's very
Mike Kelly just picking this up?
No, the first two questions how do you go to the bathroom in space, and how much money do you make?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So the first question is a lot trickier because the little amount of money that you make is much easier. And so
disappoints.
So this then is also about this is the society bit of science, that sometimes science doesn't want to talk about what everybody else actually wants to talk about. That in fact, notions of sanitation systems, notions of bathrooms, these things may not be sort of good dinner conversations, but they energize the public imagination in a way that can get people on board with ways. Charlie mentioned, yes, RNA and biological and vaccine, these things have been going on for decades, and they're paying dividends. This is important, but it's pretty boring stuff back in the day. Whereas now we can do this, and I think the same with the kinds of life support systems. What does fresh air look like? What does temperature control look like? What's humidity look like? How we are part of the making of our own environment in these, sealed little climate controlled offices that we all live in now. We make our own environment.
We do, and I think another way to meet people where they are at right now in society and still show them the magic of space exploration is to help them see the cultural side that's beginning to emerge. So we work on musical instruments for space, musical instruments that can only be played in space. So instead of just always importing Earth culture into space, there's this blank slate where we're actually going to be able to have new and exciting ways of living and doing things that have not been possible before. And I think another thing that can be done now that we're seeing some thoughtful commercialization in space is to get Disney involved. Disney's exploring how to be involved in space. Get Apple and Microsoft and these really well-known brands, and they want to explore space. They want to be able to be part of this emerging market. And it helps everyday people see, oh, okay, there's an exciting aspect to my life that can combine something that I know with this novelty in a space environment. In addition to how fascinating we do all find, the life support systems and the basic human needs, I think there's also an element of a culture that's going to begin to evolve in space.
Ariel, you just, there is one thing that always disappoints me about what's going on in commercial space today is the apparent disdain for people like Jeff and Elon or Sir Richard, people who happen to be billionaires who are putting some of their money into exploration. And they're despised because they're billionaires, and we fail to look at what they're doing. Jeff Bezos has been to space once. Elon hasn't gone to space. Sir Richard Branson has been once. And when you count the people who have flown on the spacecraft that they have invented or have produced, some of them have money, but some of them don't. You look at the people who have had an opportunity to fly that would not have flown before. Jared Isaacman, when he flew Inspiration 4, his crew members would have never gone to space had it not been for Jared's philanthropy and his desire to fly people who would be able to come back with whom normal people could identify. So I wish we would kind of stop castigating people who happen to have the wealth to make it possible for us to get to space, and at least give them credit for what they're trying to do. Now, I'll get a bunch of bad mail about this, but that's okay.
It's okay, you're welcome to join the club. Come on in, the water's terrible. Another question from the chat. What type of infrastructures are needed to encourage cross-sectoral collaboration and knowledge exchanges on space?
Ooh. Okay, David, what does history tell us? Or does it?
Of course, I cannot speak to the future. I can really only speak to the past. Historians we always retreat, but the kinds of infrastructures that were put in to go into these kinds of cross-sectoral collaborations are some, in fact, that Ariel and Charles have already mentioned, which are these sort of facilities that are put in that are next to other facilities, where you get biologists in one building who basically have to go over and talk to the engineers in the other building, and then they both have to go talk to the psychologists that neither of them understand, and they all sort of have lunch together, and there are problems that are so complex that no single scientific field, that no single set or laboratory can actually really figure out. And again, life support was one of these, that every time somebody looked at the temperature settings, or somebody looked at humidity, or someone looked at air, someone looked at water, in fact, they were very different specialities who barely even realized that they needed each other in order to figure it, because all of these things are cybernetically interrelated to one another. And this is where the biologists actually were sort of better than the rocket engineers, because the biologists at least acknowledge that all components of an organism are cybernetically interrelated. So what we need are those, they're not even interdisciplinary, they're transdisciplinary, they're cross-disciplinary kinds of things. From what I understand, exactly the kind of stuff that Ariel's lab is doing at MIT, that's really, I think that if we're going to solve the problems, that's where it's going to come from.
I was just going to say that.
Go ahead, Ariel.
Go ahead. Okay.
No, I was going to. There was a comment in the chat from I think it's a young kid who says, what we're talking about is about adults, people 18 and over, that's what he or she is getting out of this. And he says, what about a kid going with their parents? I think that's awesome. I think if a parent can responsibly take an infant, and let's think about how young we go, but a child who is an adolescent, to share the opportunity, I think we're going to get some incredible ideas out of the young mind, because their mind hasn't been shaped yet to form these opinions about what's out there, or to be swayed by their preconception of what they're going to find. I think children will see things and experience things unlike any adult. So I think there's great value to having children as young as we can safely fly have the experience of space flight.
Actually engaged. Yeah, absolutely. In terms of just building on David's comment about the different types of infrastructure that might be needed, we are lucky, I think, at the Media Lab to be a bastion of this type of natively interdisciplinary environment. So I sit right next to the biologist. There's a bio lab right next to a robotics lab, right next to an architect's lab. But beyond the kind of day-to-day infrastructure for collaboration, if the question is really about cross-sector, something that I would love to see is more on the society infrastructure standpoint, which is, I think we need in the space industry, the conventions, the global worldwide conventions like the Paris Climate Accords, Kyoto, Montreal, the history of these gathering places where we can actually begin to try to explore multi-stakeholder coordination for legal frameworks, for coordinating multinational activity in space. So I would love to see the space community come together. And I think Aspen Institute actually has a wonderful platform on which we could build an idea like this and get a cadence of worldwide, invitations for a summit or a convention of some sort to try to get this kind of collaboration going for true cross-sector endeavors.
So Ariel, are you saying we should probably update the Outer Space Treaty? Is it about time?
That is exactly what I'm saying, Marina. And the Moon Treaty and a few others, exactly. Yeah.
And we also ought to require every nation that's going to participate to sign them. Yeah, I mean, you can't write the treaty and then not sign it.
That's a great point. I think we have time for one quick question from Cynthia. For decision-making regarding space, what is the right balance between top-down regulation versus ground-up cooperation?
I'm a participatory leader, so my leadership style is to try to start at the bottom before we make a decision on anything, and get as much input from the workforce as is humanly possible. So I guess that would be a sort of a bottom-up approach, if you will, because I just think there are so many ideas that we'll never hear from if we use the top-down. Let me give you my vision, and then you all go from here. My wife and I were touring, I forget which satellite it was, we were getting ready, or I think it was a rover that we were touring down at the Kennedy Space Center before the launch. And my wife, in her infinite wisdom, went over and found one of the texts and said, hey, you all ever get a spacecraft in here that you find it's got a bad design? And they said, well, often, because we find that the configuration is not something that's user-friendly for a person like me who's going to do maintenance on it. And so we make recommendations on ways to modify the configuration. It's done, and then we can put a battery in at launch, just before launch, much easier, or we can put a reactor in much easier pre-launch than it was the way it was originally designed. So I think start down, work your way up. One person's idea.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's all the time we have today. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to everyone's questions. There are a couple great ones in the chat. But thank you so much to our panelists, Charlie, Ariel, and David, for this really great conversation, and to everyone for joining us. And I will now turn the program back over to Linda Lehrer, the Director of New York Public Programs at the Aspen Institute. Thank you for having us all here. This was really fun.
And thank you, Marina and Ariel and David and Charlie, for a far-reaching and eye-opening discussion. And I'd like to thank you all on behalf of the Aspen Institute for attending this program. And my co-host and I, and Aaron, will be back to you at some point with information on future programming. So again, thank you for being here, and thank you for our panelists.